Betty Whittaker's words don't arrive loudly. They don't accuse. They don't threaten. They arrive quietly, worn thin by years of being unheard. And that's exactly why they've shaken so many people. Her letter to Timmy isn't polished. It isn't written for headlines. It reads like something torn from the inside of a woman who has lost control of her own story and is trying, one last time, to speak directly to the person she loves most. She talks about the porch first, that old porch that held generations of memories. Summers that outsiders laughed at, but that felt complete to them. Soda bottles, barking dogs, coloring books scattered across the floor. Timmy spelling his name over and over until the paper ran out. Lorraine hiding snacks. Ray chewing tobacco. It wasn't neat. It wasn't pretty. But it was theirs. And in Betty's words, that mattered more than anything anyone else ever said about them. What makes the letter so painful isn't nostalgia. It's grief. Grief for a life that didn't end naturally, but was interrupted. She doesn't write as someone confused about what happened. She writes as someone who knows exactly what was taken and why it hurts. Her message to Timmy isn't about blame. It's about reassurance, about love that didn't disappear just because doors were closed and decisions were made without her. She tells him they didn't stop being a family because someone else decided their living conditions weren't good enough. She reminds him that being country folk was never something to be ashamed of, that they didn't need fancy things to belong together. They needed each other. And that's the sentence that keeps getting shared over and over again. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's true in a way that cuts through every argument people have made online. As the letter circulated, people began asking the same question. Was this really written by Betty? Some said yes, others weren't sure. But even the doubt says something important. Because whether Betty physically wrote every word herself or someone helped her express it, the emotions are unmistakably hers. The longing, the confusion, the heartbreak. Those aren't things you can fake easily, especially not when they match what people have seen in her eyes for months. At the same time the letter gained attention, another development quietly unfolded in the background. Adult Protective Services became involved. Not suddenly, not out of nowhere. APS doesn't move on rumors or internet outrage. They move when there are concerns about safety, autonomy, and whether someone is being properly informed or protected. And once people realized APS was involved, the conversation shifted. This wasn't just about a family being separated anymore. It wasn't just about opinions on how people should live. It became about whether Betty fully understood what was happening around her, whether she had meaningful access to her family, and whether decisions were being made with her consent or simply around her. People who had spoken to Betty before noticed changes. Calls that used to go through suddenly didn't. Messages stopped being answered. Conversations felt shorter, filtered, rehearsed. Some said she sounded unsure, like she was repeating things she'd been told rather than speaking freely. Others said they couldn't reach her at all, and when they tried, someone else answered instead. That's when fear crept in, because APS involvement doesn't automatically mean someone did something wrong, but it does mean someone raised a concern serious enough to warrant attention. And in cases involving vulnerable adults, those concerns often revolve around control, influence, and isolation. Betty's letter to Timmy suddenly felt heavier in that context. It wasn't just a message of love. It felt like a reach, a way of speaking to him when she couldn't do so directly. A reminder that no matter what paperwork existed, no matter who decided what was best, she still saw him as her family. She writes about being torn apart, not as a metaphor, but as something physical, something that happened quickly and without explanation. One moment they were together, the next they weren't, and no one sat her down and explained what would happen next in a way she could truly understand. That's the part that unsettled people the most, because removal, placement, intervention, those words sound orderly. But to the person living through it, it feels like loss, like being erased from decisions about your own life. And Betty's letter carries that ache between every line. What makes this situation even more complicated is how public it all became. The Whittaker family didn't choose to be studied, analyzed, debated. Once their lives were shared, they became symbols to strangers. Some people wanted to save them. Others wanted to control the narrative. And somewhere in the middle, the family themselves lost the ability to simply exist without commentary. APS stepping in didn't quiet the noise. It amplified it. People began speculating about who called, why now, and what would happen next. But Betty's letter cut through all of that. It wasn't a legal document. It wasn't an accusation. It was a mother figure speaking to someone she loves, telling him he was never abandoned, even if circumstances forced distance. She doesn't ask Timmy to fight. She doesn't ask him to blame anyone. She asks him to remember that happiness doesn't always look like what outsiders expect. To remember that being together mattered more than appearances. To remember her. That's why so many people reacted emotionally. Because regardless of where you stand on the decisions that were made, the letter reminds you of something uncomfortable. Systems can intervene. Authorities can decide. But emotional bonds don't dissolve on command. And this is where the story pauses, not because it's finished, but because it's entering a more serious phase. APS involvement means evaluations, interviews, assessments. It means people who were never meant to be public figures are now being discussed in official settings. It means the next steps won't be driven by internet opinion, but by processes that move slowly and quietly. But Betty's voice, fragile as it may be, has already made its way out. And once words like hers are released, they don't disappear. They sit with you. They ask you to consider whether protection sometimes looks like separation or whether it can also look like listening. Her letter to Timmy doesn't demand answers. It demands humanity. And that's why it matters. If you've read Betty's letter or followed this story closely, share your thoughts below. Do you think her voice is truly being heard right now, or is it getting lost in decisions made for her? The involvement of adult protective services changed the tone of everything overnight. What had once been framed as a family story, messy and emotional, but familiar, shifted into something far more serious. When APS enters a situation, it's no longer about opinions or sympathy. It's about assessments, documentation, and determining whether someone's rights, safety, or autonomy are at risk. For Betty, that shift wasn't explained in a way that made sense to her. People close to the situation say she wasn't told, clearly or calmly, what APS involvement meant. She wasn't walked through the process step by step. Instead, things simply started happening around her. Appointments were scheduled. Conversations happened without her present. Decisions were discussed in language that didn't belong to her world. That's the part many people still don't understand. APS isn't a villain by default. In many cases, they step in to prevent harm. But when communication breaks down, even protection can feel like punishment. And for someone like Betty, whose life has always been shaped by others making choices on her behalf, that feeling hits harder than most realize. People noticed that Betty's access to Timmy became more restricted after APS stepped in. Phone calls that used to be frequent suddenly stopped. Messages were delayed or unanswered. When she did speak, her words sounded careful, as if she was afraid of saying the wrong thing. Not because she had something to hide, but because she didn't want to make things worse. That's where her letter takes on even more meaning. Written words don't get interrupted. They don't get redirected. They don't get softened by someone standing nearby. A letter is one of the few ways Betty could speak without being filtered. And in that letter, she didn't challenge APS. She didn't criticize the process. She spoke directly to Timmy's heart. She told him she remembered everything. The ordinary moments, the routines that outsiders called dysfunction, but that felt like stability to them. In doing so, she reminded him, and herself, that their bond didn't come from paperwork or approval. It came from shared life. As APS began its evaluation, people started asking uncomfortable questions. Who raised the initial concerns? Were those concerns about safety or about compliance? Was Betty viewed as someone needing support or as someone incapable of understanding her own circumstances? Those questions matter because the answers shape outcomes. There's a difference between offering help and removing agency. And that line can blur quickly when assumptions replace conversation. Several individuals who had interacted with Betty before APS involvement describe her as consistent. She had routines. She knew who she trusted. She could express her wants clearly when given time and space. But once the process began, that space shrank. Everything felt rushed, and rushed decisions rarely leave room for dignity. Timmy, meanwhile, was placed in a position he never should have been in. He became the silent center of a conflict he didn't create. People spoke about his future, his needs, his safety, but often without asking how he felt. Betty's letter acknowledges that pain without naming it directly. She doesn't say, "This is unfair." She says, "We were happy." That sentence challenges the entire narrative. Because if happiness existed, even in imperfect conditions, then the situation isn't as simple as rescue. It becomes a question of balance. How do you protect without erasing what mattered? APS workers are trained to look for risk factors, living conditions, financial instability, support systems, but emotional bonds don't always fit neatly into checklists. And when they're overlooked, families fracture in ways that don't show up on reports. Another layer complicating everything was the public attention. Once the Whittaker name became widely known, every action was scrutinized. APS doesn't operate in a vacuum. They're aware when a case is high profile. That pressure can influence how cautiously or aggressively decisions are made. Betty's letter went viral precisely because it cut through that noise. It didn't argue facts. It argued feeling. And feelings are harder to dismiss. People who support APS involvement argue that structure and oversight are necessary, that Betty needed protection from being overwhelmed or influenced, and those concerns shouldn't be dismissed outright. Vulnerability is real. Exploitation is real. But protection should never mean isolation. It should never mean silencing. One of the most troubling developments was how quickly Betty's world narrowed. Familiar faces disappeared. Trusted voices were replaced by professionals she didn't know. While intention may have been safety, the result felt like loss. This is where systems often fail the people they're meant to serve. They move efficiently, but not gently. They prioritize outcomes over experience. And for someone like Betty, experience is everything. Her letter doesn't ask APS to leave. It asks for connection, for understanding that removing someone from harm shouldn't also remove them from love. Timmy isn't just a case file to her. He's family, and family doesn't dissolve because circumstances change. As the process continues, the biggest question remains unanswered. Is Betty being included in decisions about her own life, or merely informed after they're made? Inclusion looks like explanation, patience, and respect. Exclusion looks like silence. People following the situation are divided. Some believe APS intervention was long overdue. Others believe it came too late and too forcefully. But nearly everyone agrees on one thing. Betty's voice matters. Her letter wasn't defiant. It was vulnerable. And vulnerability should never be punished. What happens next will depend on whether the system listens as much as it evaluates. Whether Timmy's emotional ties are considered alongside his material needs. Whether Betty is treated as a person with a history, not a problem to be managed. Because when families are separated, the damage doesn't end with placement. It lingers. It shapes how people trust or stop trusting those meant to help them. Betty's words remain out there now. They can't be taken back. And maybe that's the point. She spoke when she felt she couldn't speak anymore. She reached for Timmy in the only way she could. The question isn't whether APS has authority. It does. The question is whether it has empathy. And that's where this story still hangs in the balance. What do you think? Was APS involvement necessary protection, or did it go too far by cutting off Betty's voice? Share your thoughts below. What followed next was not loud, dramatic, or explosive. It was quieter than that, and in many ways, more damaging. The silence around Betty deepened. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that grows when decisions are being made without you, when conversations happen in rooms you're not invited into, when your name is spoken in reports instead of in questions. By the time Adult Protective Services had fully settled into the case, Betty's daily life no longer belonged to her. Simple routines were interrupted. People who once checked in casually now hesitated, unsure whether contact was allowed, appropriate, or permitted. That uncertainty spread quickly, and isolation followed. This is the part many people misunderstand about cases like this. Isolation doesn't always come from intention. Often, it comes from fear. People don't want to interfere. They don't want to make things worse. So they step back. And when everyone steps back at once, the person at the center is left alone. Betty felt that shift immediately. She didn't say it outright, but those close to her noticed how her energy changed. She became more subdued, less expressive, not because she had nothing to say, but because she wasn't sure who was listening or how her words might be interpreted. Her letter to Timmy wasn't just an emotional expression. It was a lifeline. Writing gave her control in a situation where control had been steadily taken away. Every sentence was deliberate. Every memory chosen carefully. She didn't want to trigger concern or suspicion. She wanted to reassure him, and maybe, in the process, reassure herself. Timmy's situation grew more complicated as well. With APS involved, his world became structured in ways that didn't feel familiar. New schedules, new expectations, new people telling him what was best. Change can be destabilizing for anyone, but for someone who relied on routine and familiarity, it was overwhelming. What made it worse was the absence of context. Timmy wasn't given a clear explanation of why things were happening. He was told what to do, where to go, when to comply, but not why his family bond had suddenly become a problem that needed managing. Betty understood that fear. She had lived her entire life with others deciding what was appropriate for her. She had learned early on that asking too many questions could be mistaken for resistance. So she didn't push. She waited, and waiting took its toll. As weeks passed, people began to notice inconsistencies. Information shared with one person didn't match what another was told. Some were told Betty couldn't be contacted. Others were told she didn't want contact. The truth was far simpler and far more painful. Betty didn't know what she was allowed to do anymore. That kind of confusion erodes confidence. It makes people second-guess themselves. And for someone already navigating a system they don't fully understand, it creates a constant sense of anxiety. Meanwhile, public conversation continued without her. Commentators debated her capacity. Strangers speculated about her intentions. Some painted her as fragile and incapable. Others as stubborn and resistant. Very few spoke about her as a whole person. That's the danger of systems intersecting with public attention. Once a narrative forms, it's hard to undo. And Betty didn't have the platform or the energy to correct it. Her letter to Timmy became one of the few authentic windows into her reality. She didn't argue for reunification outright. She didn't demand change. She reminded him of love, of shared history, of identity. Identity matters more than people realize. When everything else is taken away, your home, your routines, your family, identity is often the last thing holding you together. Betty knew that. She was trying to protect Timmy's sense of self, even from a distance. The response to the letter was immediate. Some people were moved. Others questioned its authenticity. That doubt hurt more than criticism ever could. To suggest that Betty wasn't capable of expressing herself so clearly was another form of erasure. People who had spent time with her pushed back against that idea. They said she had always been thoughtful when given time, that she expressed herself better in writing than in rushed conversations, that the letters sounded exactly like her. Still, the doubt lingered, and that doubt fed into the broader issue at hand. Who gets to decide whose voice is valid? As APS continued its process, the focus remained on assessments and outcomes. Reports were written, recommendations discussed, but very little attention was paid to emotional continuity, to the trauma of separation, to the grief that doesn't show up on checklists. Betty's physical needs were addressed. Her housing situation was stabilized. Her basic care was ensured. But emotional care is harder to quantify, and without it, even the best intentions fall short. Timmy began to withdraw. Those around him noticed he spoke less about the future. He stopped asking when he would see Betty again. That silence was mistaken for adjustment. In reality, it was resignation. Betty sensed that too. She worried that by not being present, she was slowly being erased from his daily life. Not deliberately, but inevitably. Memories fade when they aren't reinforced, and she feared becoming a story instead of constant. That fear is what fueled her continued attempts to communicate, even when responses were slow or non-existent. She wasn't trying to undermine anyone. She was trying to remain visible. At the same time, professionals involved in the case faced their own pressures. They had to follow protocols. They had to document everything. They had to justify decisions in case of scrutiny. That environment doesn't always allow for flexibility. But flexibility is exactly what this situation required. Not leniency, not neglect, humanity. There's a way to protect someone without cutting them off from everyone they love. There is a way to include families in care plans instead of treating them as obstacles. And there's a way to listen without assuming incapacity. Betty's story sits at the intersection of all those failures and possibilities. She never said the system was evil. She never accused anyone of malice. She simply asked to be remembered as a mother, a sister, a person, not a case. As the weeks turned into months, the question became unavoidable. Was this process helping Timmy heal, or was it teaching him that love is conditional? That connection can be removed without explanation. Those lessons last far longer than any placement. Betty continued to wait, to hope, to write when she could. Each letter carried the same underlying message. I'm still here. I still love you. You still belong. And that message matters more than any report. The outcome of this situation isn't finalized yet. Decisions are still being reviewed. Recommendations still debated. But one thing is already clear. The emotional cost has been enormous. Families don't recover easily from separation, especially when separation happens without clarity or closure. Betty's strength has always been quiet. She doesn't demand attention. She doesn't shout. She endures. But endurance shouldn't be mistaken for consent. As this process moves forward, the people in charge face a choice. They can continue to prioritize procedure over personhood, or they can pause long enough to ask a simple question. How do we protect without erasing? Timmy's future depends on more than stability. It depends on belonging. And Betty's presence, however limited, has always been part of that. This isn't about undoing what's been done. It's about deciding what happens next. Whether the system will recognize that love is not a risk factor and family is not automatically a liability. Betty's letter was not a protest. It was a reminder. And reminders only work if someone is willing to listen. What do you think should happen next? Should Betty be given more access and a stronger voice in the process? Or is the system right to keep firm boundaries? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The final stage of this story does not arrive with resolution. It arrives with consequences. Not the kind that fit neatly into a report or a press release, but the kind that linger quietly in people long after the paperwork is finished. By the time the process reached this point, the damage had already been done in small, cumulative ways. Trust had eroded. Routines had been broken. Familiar voices were no longer part of daily life. And for Betty, the realization settled in that no outcome, good or bad, would ever truly return things to how they were before. The involvement of adult protective services created a dividing line in time. There was life before intervention and life after. Everything after came with conditions, supervision, and limits that Betty never imagined she would have to navigate at this stage of her life. One of the hardest truths she faced was that intention no longer mattered as much as perception. She could say she loved Timmy. She could show concern. She could express longing. But every action was filtered through assessment. Was it appropriate? Was it healthy? Was it allowed? When love becomes something that needs permission, it changes shape. Betty's days became structured around waiting. Waiting for updates. Waiting for responses. Waiting for permission to speak, to write, to visit. Waiting is exhausting when you don't know what you're waiting for. And Timmy, on the other side of that separation, learned a different lesson. He learned that stability can come at the cost of connection, that safety can feel like silence, that being cared for doesn't always mean being understood. People around him noticed subtle changes. He complied more. He asked fewer questions. He adapted quickly, but not because he felt secure, because he didn't feel he had a choice. This is where systems often mistake compliance for well-being. A quiet person is assumed to be adjusting. A person who doesn't resist is assumed to be comfortable. But silence is not consent, and adjustment is not healing. Betty worried about that constantly. She worried that Timmy would internalize the separation as something deserved, that he would believe their bond was fragile, temporary, or wrong. She worried that one day he would stop reaching back, not out of anger, but out of habit. That fear haunted her more than any official decision ever could. As the case progressed, professionals involved began to shift focus toward long-term planning, stability metrics, placement evaluations, sustainability. These are important considerations. But nowhere in those conversations did Betty hear language that acknowledged grief. Grief doesn't fit easily into policy. It can't be measured. It doesn't resolve on a timeline, but exists whether or not it's acknowledged. Betty grieved the loss of shared mornings, the loss of simple check-ins, the loss of being someone Timmy could turn to without hesitation. She grieved not knowing what he was afraid of now, or what made him laugh, or whether he still remembered the small rituals they shared. Those details are what make a family real. And when they're stripped away, what remains feels hollow. At the same time, public discourse continued. Some people praised the intervention as necessary. Others criticized it as excessive. Very few centered Betty's emotional reality in those conversations. She became an abstract idea, a symbol of either neglect or victimhood, rather than a person living through uncertainty. That abstraction is dangerous. Once someone becomes a symbol, their humanity becomes negotiable. Betty never wanted to be a symbol. She wanted to be present. She wanted to be included. She wanted to matter. What's often overlooked in cases like this is the possibility of shared responsibility. Systems tend to operate in binaries: safe or unsafe, capable or incapable, allowed or forbidden. But real life exists in the gray. There were ways to support Timmy while maintaining meaningful contact with Betty, ways to supervise interaction without severing it, ways to include her voice in decisions that affected both of them. Those options were discussed, but not prioritized. Instead, efficiency took precedence. Clear boundaries are easier to enforce than nuanced ones. And in that efficiency, something essential was lost. Betty noticed it in herself first. She became less confident when speaking, less certain when expressing needs. She second-guessed her instincts. That self-doubt didn't come from incompetence. It came from being consistently overruled. When someone is repeatedly told, implicitly or explicitly, that others know better, they begin to internalize that message, even when it contradicts their lived experience. Timmy experienced a version of that too. He learned that decisions happened above him, around him, without him, that his feelings were noted but not necessarily acted upon. That adaptation was expected. Adaptation, however, is not the same as resilience. Resilience involves agency, choice, the ability to influence outcomes. Without those elements, what looks like resilience is often just endurance. As the months progressed, contact between Betty and Timmy became sporadic, structured, formal. Each interaction carried weight. Each word felt scrutinized. Spontaneity disappeared. Betty felt like she was performing motherhood instead of living it. And yet, she continued, because giving up was never an option, even when it hurt, even when it felt futile, even when silence stretched longer than she could bear. Her persistence was not defiance. It was devotion. The hardest realization came when Betty understood that the system would eventually move on. Cases close. Files are archived. Staff rotate. But she would still be living with the outcome. Timmy would still be shaped by this period of separation, by what it taught him about love, authority, and belonging. That responsibility weighs heavily on people like Betty. People whose lives don't reset when professionals exit the picture. What happens after oversight ends? After monitoring stops? After reports are filed? Those questions rarely receive the attention they deserve. Because true accountability doesn't end when a case is resolved. It continues in the lives affected by those decisions. Betty doesn't ask for the past to be undone. She asks for recognition, for dignity, for a role in the future she helped create. She asks that Timmy not be taught that love is conditional or that family is a problem to be solved. As this chapter draws to a close, the story remains unfinished. Outcomes will be decided, plans implemented, but the emotional truth will persist. Systems can provide structure. They can provide protection, but they cannot replace connection. And connection is what sustains people long after safety is established. Betty's letter was never meant to challenge authority. It was meant to preserve memory, to say, I am still here. I still care. I still matter to you. That message deserves more than acknowledgement. It deserves response. The question now is not whether intervention was necessary. The question is whether compassion will be allowed to coexist with control, whether Betty will be seen not as a risk, but as a resource, whether Timmy will be given not just stability, but continuity. Because healing doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in relationship. And relationships don't thrive when they're treated as liabilities. As observers, supporters, and members of a broader community, there's a role to play here, not in assigning blame, but in insisting on humanity. Systems improve when they're questioned thoughtfully, when outcomes are examined honestly, when people refuse to accept that care must come at the cost of connection. Betty's story is not unique. but it is specific, and specificity matters. Because behind every case number is a person waiting to be heard. Behind every placement decision is a relationship altered. Behind every letter is a voice asking not to be forgotten. So the final question is simple, but not easy. Can protection exist without erasure? Can safety include love? And will the people with power choose to listen before silence becomes permanent? What do you think should happen next for Betty and Timmy? Should family bonds be restored where possible, even within structured care? Or is separation the only responsible path? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.